services, responsible parenthood, and adolescent development. In 2000, PCPD was reorganized as a grant-giving foundation. It supported the efforts of partners that responded to various concerns, such as housing, waste management, food security, climate change, and reproductive health. In 2020, PCPD decided to shift from giving grants to becoming a social enterprise. It is studying the feasibility of setting up a hospital that would specialize on women's and children's health care, while at the same time provide a broad range of health services to the general public. As it continues to evolve, one thing has remained constant for PCPD. Through its various transformations, PCPD's commitment is to contribute to improve the quality of life of Filipinos. Initially known as the Population Center Foundation, the Philippine Center for Population and Development was created in 1973 to complement the government's National Population Program. In its first 26 years, PCF implemented projects that delivered information, training, and family planning services. In development. In 2000, PCPD was reorganized as a grant-giving foundation. It supported the efforts of partners that responded to various concerns, such as housing, waste management, food security, climate change, and reproductive health. In 2020, PCPD decided to shift from giving grants to becoming a social enterprise. It is studying the feasibility of setting up a hospital that would specialize on women's and children's health care, while at the same time provide a broad range of health services to the general public. As it continues to evolve, one thing has remained constant for PCPD. Through its various transformations, PCPD's commitment is to contribute to improve the quality of life of Filipinos. Initially known as the Population Center Foundation, the Philippine Center for Population and Development was created in 1973 to complement the government's National Population Program. In its first 26 years, PCF implemented projects that delivered information, training, and family planning services. In 1992, the foundation broadened its mandate from population to Population and Development, or PopDev, and it changed its name to the Philippine Center for Population and Development. As a PopDev organization, PCPD implemented projects on community-based health education and services, responsible parenthood, and adolescent development. In 2000, PCPD was reorganized as a grant-giving foundation. It supported the efforts of partners that responded to various concerns, such as housing, waste management, food security, climate change, and reproductive health. In 2020, PCPD decided to shift from giving grants to becoming a social enterprise. It is studying the feasibility of setting up a hospital that would specialize on women's and children's health care, while at the same time provide a broad range of health services to the general public. As it continues to evolve, one thing has remained constant for PCPD. Through its various transformations, PCPD's commitment is to contribute to improve the quality of life of Filipinos.
Okay, good morning. We're done. We're just about to start. Good morning and welcome to everybody. My name is Marilen Dangilan. I'm the Executive Director of the Philippine Center for Population and Development. And as you've heard, PCPD is involved in a very broad range of topics. But these webinars, which we have started in May of last year, was intended to highlight topics that are not being talked about in the general public, or they are not being talked about in the mainstream media or in social media even. These are topics like the DOH budget for 2022, like the women's rights in Muslim Mindanao, marriages and divorce, teenage pregnancy, and climate change, among others, and nutrition. Yes. And today's topic is one of a series, and we're holding this together with our partner, Para Bukas. They're going to introduce themselves. And we are going to have, we already had one of the webinars last month on what is climate change about and how it's affecting us. And we're going to have, this is our second in the series, and we're going to have two more, you know, this coming up, I think up to April. So our moderator for today is attorney Alaya De Leon, and she's one of the co-founders of Parabucas. And she will introduce her organization as well as the range of outstanding speakers that we have in our list. So stay on and hang on and, enjoy the conversations and participate in the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Doc Marilyn, for opening our program today, and good morning to everyone. We're very happy that you can join us. Before I get into more of the introductions, I'd like to invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box. I can see that a lot of introductions and very bright good morning greetings are already happening. I can feel the energy, so let's keep that going throughout the webinar today. And I can also see that all three island groups of the Philippines are already represented. I've seen some people mention where they are coming from. And I think I also saw someone from the US joining us. So please keep the introductions coming, as we would be very interested to see where everyone is joining from and to see the diverse backgrounds of the people joining our discussion today. And also to inform everyone that we are recording today's session for your information for documentation purposes. So to introduce my organization, I am Alaya or Aya De Leon. I am a co-founder and director of Parabucas. Um, Parabucas is an Asia-based legal and policy consultancy focused on climate change, sustainable development, and other environmental issues. So we are lawyers by trade, but our focus is really looking at the intersections between climate change and many other issues that are affected by climate change and or affect climate change or exacerbate the effects of climate change in many ways. So this series of webinars that we've been fortunate to partner with PCPD is really very interesting for us as an organization, because we are trying to highlight the links between climate change and health and many interrelated issues. And as you will see throughout this discussion, we really cannot talk about health, food security, nutrition, climate change, disasters in silos, but they necessarily have to be talked about and understood and addressed in an interrelated way. So that's what we're trying to achieve through this webinar series. And we want to, just to give a bit of a background on the series of discussions. As Doc Marilyn said, the series has been going on for some time, but the focus on climate change and health and other related issues is relatively new. So this is the second with our partnership with PCPD. And this series intends to raise awareness and deepen understanding of climate change and particularly how it impacts us in concrete ways, how to make it less abstract and more understandable as individuals, as citizens, as members of our community, as people working in our various fields. How does climate change affect us, and how can we influence the climate, and how to address the issues related to climate change. This is also part of a call for the upcoming elections. We want this to be a very relevant discussion series. We want to emphasize that climate action should be front and center in candidates' platforms, given the existential threat that climate change poses. And I think one of the first views that we've had on like peaks that we've had in this issue was the recent presidential interviews that were conducted by Jessica Soho. And if I'm not mistaken, the candidates did mention some takes on the environment, but this is still very light touch, still really not going deep into the issues. And we want this to be a more central part of their agenda, of their platforms, as we decide on who to vote for, both at the national level and at the local level. Last November was our first of this discussion series on climate change, and the first one focused on the basics of climate change and the outcomes of the 26th Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was held in Glasgow in November, December of last year. And it's because it's such a broad topic, we had to squeeze in a lot in the 2 hours that we had, but it was a very rich discussion, and we hope to continue in that spirit now, going into more specifics, into more particular issues as we go through the rest of the webinar. So this is not the last of the series. We will also be looking at gender and other issues in the upcoming webinar. So we hope you can continue to join us. Okay, so if you have any questions, clarifications, thoughts, comments that come to mind, please do feel free to put those in the chat. We are monitoring the chat boxes, and we will have some time at the end of the moderated discussion to go through some questions or comments. But anytime that you feel like raising something in the chat box, please feel free. So just to explain the flow of today's program, we have three very esteemed and very well-versed experts that will be joining us in today's discussion. Sorry, I forgot to mention the title of the webinar for today. So our topic for today is Nagbabantang Taggutom: Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security. I kept saying we are going into the specifics, but I forgot to say what the specific focus of today's webinar will be. Today we will be looking, through the help of our experts, we will be looking at the impacts of climate change on agriculture, food security, nutrition, and many other things in between that our experts will guide us through. So among our speakers, there will be one presentation from Dr. Cecilia Aquin, and then we will proceed to a moderated question and answer, which I will be moderating. And after that, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. But like I said, the questions, you can post them at any time, and you don't have to wait until the end of the program. Okay, so now I will go to our speakers. I will introduce our speakers. We have three women speakers, and this is very inspiring for me always when I see a panel of experts, of women really doing advancing the cause in their respective fields. So first, I will introduce Dr. Saturnina Halos. She is the president of the Biotechnology Coalition of the Philippines. Dr. Halos has been providing the scientific basis for policies of the Department of Agriculture in biotechnology since 1999 and in climate change since 2013. She was a member of the Congressional Technical Team that crafted the Agriculture and Fisheries Modernization Act, or AFMA, of 1997 and provided technical inputs in the drafting of the Organic Agriculture Act of 2010, the Food Safety Act of 2013, and the Agriculture and Fisheries Mechanization Act of 2013. She served as technical advisor in drafting the internal implementing rules and regulations of the rice liberalization law with NEDA. She also led a team of experts at the UPLB Foundation, Inc. in crafting policies on disaster risk reduction and management in agriculture. She is presently the president and chair of the board of directors, Biotechnology Coalition of the Philippines, and she is a former professor in molecular biology and biotechnology at UP Diliman and has held various academic and scientific positions in other institutions. Good morning, Doc Halos. We're so happy to have you here today.
Good morning, Ayan. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you. That's as you can see, we have so much expertise and experience from just our first speaker, but I will continue to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Monica Ortiz. She is a senior research fellow at the Manila Observatory and also a fellow at Parabucas. Dr. Ortiz is an interdisciplinary scientist who focuses on food security and climate change. She is currently a senior research fellow at the Manila Observatory and fellow at Parabucas, and she has experience with climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, policy, and environmental education. She did her postdoctoral fellowship at University College London and her doctorate at the University of Sheffield on the assessment of climate change impacts on agriculture using climate and crop models. Good morning, Monica. Although I think it's evening where you are, Doc Ortiz.
Oh, very good morning, Nalan. Good morning,
Good
everyone.
morning.
Thanks, Aya, for the introduction.
We have an international panel joining us today. And our third speaker, Dr. Cecilia Acuin, is currently an adjunct associate professor at the Institute of Human Nutrition and Food at UPLB. She took her PhD in nutrition at Cornell University, her MA in medical anthropology at the University of Connecticut, and her MD at the University of the Philippines. So she is very doctor. Research on nutrition has been central to Dr. Acuin's professional life as she has been involved in both local and international studies on the subject. She currently chairs the Philippine National Health Research Systems Research Utilization Committee. She was past president of the Philippine Association of Nutrition and is now an ex officio director of the group. She has recently been appointed chair of the technical advisory group to the Golden Rice Project. Good morning, Dr. Ces.
Good morning. Magandang umaga po sa lahat. I'm so happy to be here and to share the discussions with you.
Thank you very much. So we have really a powerhouse of amazing speakers today. So we hope you can stay throughout the project, and as I'm sure we will learn so many valuable things from our group of speakers. At this time, I will now turn it over to Doc Ces to have her presentation. Doc Ces, please take it away.
Thank you, Alaya. And let me share I hope it's going to be a short presentation. Can you see my screen? Ay, ano nangyari sa screen ko? Teka, sandali ah.
Graduates.
Oo nga. Mali. Sorry. Akala ko yan. So, let me just explain a little that I was intending to be the third speaker and focusing just on food and nutrition security for this session. But as it turns out, I'm the only one with a presentation. So I hope you don't mind that the areas that I thought my my co-panelists will cover, I'm not going to speak very much on. But because food and nutrition are, as you will see, the connections that matter for us, that viewing it from that lens also provides, I think, a comprehensive view of how agriculture and food security links together with climate change. So I prepared an outline, but I don't think we'll have time. And I think it's going to be much more enriching if we get questions from you so that we can cover more ground and we'll discuss things that really matter to you. So I'm cutting out the last 3 topics in my presentation and just focusing on the topics that you see in white in the outline. I'm also going to use some local examples. As you can see, our rice terraces, ganda niyan, ano, sa Batagyan, sa Ifugao, to highlight some of the issues. And I think this is something that will resonate with my co-panelists that affect our food supply as well as the nutrition that we get from our food. So just as a start, and I'm taking off also from the fact that there has already been a previous session on climate change. So I'm not going to discuss that very much. And also that we've had a session on food systems with PCPD, I think sometime in September or October. So I hope you viewed those sessions. If not, then maybe you can bring up any gaps that we may not have covered during the question and answer. So I just want to highlight the fact that nutrition security, at least if you look at it from a simplified perspective, is actually food security plus food quality. So pag pinagsama yon, yun yung nutrition security na tinatawag namin in a simplified way. Ito yung more elaborate definition, pero para lang tayo ay magkakaintindihan sa ating mga definitions. No? So, importante kasi yung aspects of food safety, sufficient quantity and quality, meeting, of course, our individual dietary needs, and in a supportive environment of adequate water, sanitation, health services, and care. So you can see it's a pretty comprehensive perspective. Initially, hindi ganyan ang paningin sa food security. Noong una, I think this was in the 60s or the 70s, ang pananaw nila ay pagkain lang, kahit anong lamang tiyan. So even now, FAO continues to use this indicator on prevalence of undernourishment, which only encompasses the calories that people consume. But in nutrition, we know that calories are not enough, that we also need all of the other nutrients, both the macro and the micronutrients, in order to have good health and an active life. So yan po yung ating pinaninimulan pag pinag-usapan natin ang food and nutrition security. Now, nung September or October, we also talked about the food system. So this is going to be a review for many of you. But I think what is important is it resonates that idea of connectedness that Attorney Alaya brought up earlier, that we are all connected through our food system. And because our food system is so dependent on climate change, as you will hear from my next few slides, that is why we are also all connected by climate change. The other aspect during that September webinar that I thought was important also to highlight as far as thinking about a system is concerned, or a food system where we are all connected, is that it also becomes very apparent kung ano yung ating stake, ano yung ating puhunan dyan sa sistemang yan, kasi we own it, and who is going to be accountable for what becomes more apparent pag tiningnan mo as a system. So hindi lang yan sa food system nag-a-apply, syempre lalo na sa food sa ating climate change and environmental systems. So I'm now going to transition to a discussion of our food and nutrition aspects related to climate change. So I use that same connectedness theme. So makikita nyo dito sa slide na to, actually halos pareho lang yan nung kanina, no, na food supply, pero finocus natin dito sa, or sorry, food systems, pero we focused mainly on the supply chain, which is where our food consumption connects with agriculture and then consequently connects with climate change. So if you notice in the middle, all of these arrows, ito yung mga iba-ibang steps ng ating food supply chain. No? If you are a student of nutrition, a student of agriculture, and related areas, you will see yourself in that in those arrows. Now, above the arrow, yan yung mga opportunities where nutrition enters the food supply chain. No, so paano napapadami o napapabuti ang nutrition na food supply chain. At yun namang sa baba na mga boxes, yan yung mga aspeto ng ating food supply chain where nababawasan or nag-e-exit ang nutrition from the food supply chain. So I won't have time to go into all of these, but I do want to highlight for you some of the boxes that where I think napakahalaga ng climate change. Kasi alam naman ninyo from the December discussion that climate change engenders or has brought about many changes, foremost of which are let's say a change in our temperature, the average temperature of our Earth, of our planet, and this change in temperature and other consequent effects on water, on land, affect very much the life on Earth. So, and life is not just human life; it also includes other flora and fauna. So you have in this box, for example, insects. But here we view insects as a source of nutrients. So the consumption of insects is an important resiliency factor for nutrition in the food supply chain. Aflatoxin is a product of some fungi that can find their way into our food, like especially peanuts and other ground nuts, no? And these are toxins, poisons to the body, and that's why I highlight that as an important box for this graph. Also, the other ways by which we deal with food storage, so fermentation, for example, or drying, these are all affected also by climate change, and consequently in the nutrition minimizing side sa baba, no? So contamination, spoilage. So we'll talk a little about food safety, nutrient losses, not just during milling, but also during interactions with other processes in food processing, and these are also affected by climate change. And later we will also talk about some aspects of access to food. Bakit nagkakaroon ng food deserts, mga lugar na walang masustansyang pagkain, no? Pag-uusapan din natin yan. So kumbaga, think of this as a way of just linking or connecting things to each other. Then I hope that I'm hoping my co-panelists will talk about this important box, which is how our plant varieties are affected by climate change, because this also determines the nutrients that are retained by these plants that we consume or that we eat in the process, or when they are undergoing this increased temperature, for example, or increased carbon dioxide in the environment, that are the consequences of climate change. So I hope that's my colleagues who are more expert in that line than I am are going to cover that topic. Now let's go a little deeper into this food supply chain. So ito po yung nakita kong medyo magandang logo ng climate change, no? At ang epekto ng climate change that matters to food and nutrition security can be summarized in these three arms. So sa agriculture, yan po yung logo ng Department of Agriculture natin, through food access and through disease and pestilence. So yun po yung tatlong aspects dyan. And when you break that down into some specifics of how this happens, so in terms of food production in agriculture, that is through the quantity of food, and I think my co-panelists will talk about that. And in terms of food quality, napakahalaga yung diet diversity, which is coming from the diversity of food production, because that's also one of the consequences of climate change, and the nutrient content of our, as I mentioned earlier, of our different food products. Then food access, this middle figure here, is very much affected by, is very much affected by these different factors. So extreme weather events, economic barriers, sociocultural norms, and movement restrictions that we are now experiencing here because of the pandemic. We'll discuss that a little, but I think it would be better for you to raise questions about this kasi ano talaga nito. Malaki ang impact nito sa kung paano nakakarating sa atin ang ating pagkain. And then as I mentioned earlier, aspects of food safety, food loss or food waste. Isipin nyo na lang, let's say ang red tide, no? Na isa sa mga malaking pangyayari na lalong lumalaganap dahil sa climate change, which affects our seafood, and hindi natin sila nakakain for several months during the year because of the changes in our sea environment brought about by climate change. So again, think of this as a summary of how things happen and how climate change impacts on our food. So this is, I saw this in one of the UN websites on climate change, and it illustrates how just one aspect of climate change makes food less safe. So this relates to the earlier figure where I bring up the issue of food safety as one of the consequences of climate change. So we know that with the temperature increase, there is increasing incidence of infections from food and waterborne pathogens. So mga mikrobyo na nasa pagkain or nasa tubig, mas lumalaganap sila dahil sa mas tumataas na temperatura ng ating environment at ng ating waterways, no? Also, and this is more related to agriculture, the plant pests, nagbabago ang kanilang geographic distribution. So they go into new territories dati wala, ngayon meron na. And this could drive our farmers to using more and more pesticides in order to make our food both edible as well as palatable. Then the higher uptake of toxic heavy metals in staple crops, and this is again an important consequence of climate change. I think maybe Dr. Halos might speak of this in her discussions later, kasi alam natin na pag nagbabago yung temperatura, nagbabago yung mga chemical interactions sa ating soil, and those conditions are then affecting the uptake of these heavy metals that are normally in the soil but may not normally be taken up by our crops, but because of their increasing concentrations or because of a change in the acidity of our soil or in the temperature of our soil, they might be more likely to be taken up by our staples and wind up in our food supply. And then I mentioned earlier the control of aflatoxins, which is just an example of the many mycotoxins. These are fungal byproducts that are poisonous to the body, and because of the change in temperature, the fungal growth might be occurring in places where they have not occurred before. Or they might be more likely to grow faster and be difficult to control, making them more likely to increase the toxins that they produce into our food supply. Then in our seas and oceans, no, ito kayo, I alluded to this earlier, yung ating red tide nga is an excellent example of how climate change is affecting the food that we get from our seafood, no. At hindi lang red tide yung nagiging epekto niyan. I hope we'll have time to discuss that later. Now, the other, so alam natin yun ang mga epekto ng climate change sa ating pagkain. Pero ang nangyayari, it becomes a crisis multiplier. So hindi lang niya naaapektuhan yung pagkain, naaapektuhan din niya yung access sa pagkain. So with increased disaster intensity and frequency, and we are living examples of how these increased intensity and frequency of disasters is experienced by a country. Ito yung mga nangyayari. Bumababa ang productivity ng ating lupa, ang ating tubig ay nagiging less and less available. Of course, this is also complicated or confounded by human activities, which we can discuss later. So that means our water sanitation and hygiene, yan po yung WASH, interventions need to be even stronger and better distributed so that water is safe, not just for ourselves, but also for our livestock and our plants. Now, this decrease in land productivity and water availability means that there is decreased household food production and household income production and decreased purchasing power, especially of agricultural households. So yung nawawala ng value o nababawasan ng value ang kanilang mga lupa, no? And this decrease in production and asset and the increase in asset depletion means that people can no longer support themselves from where they are, and that leads to increased migration. And as a consequence, because of conflict over resources or conflict over opportunities, we experience increased conflict. So alam natin na nangyayari yan, pero pag pinagdugtong-dugtong mo, baka hindi mo masyadong kailangan mong pagdugtong-dugtungin para maintindihan mo na lahat ito ay nangyayari affected by climate change. And when you look at this from a food and nutrition perspective. And this was a projection of the World Food Program in 2010 pa. Sinabi na ng World Food Program, dahil nangyayari itong mga bagay-bagay na ito due to climate change, they were projecting a 10 to 20% increase in hunger. Mind you, without COVID pa yan, ha? No COVID, no other calamities or disasters, but just these changes brought about by climate change, and consequently an increase of 20% in child malnutrition. Now we know that with COVID, these figures are going to be even higher. So you can imagine what the consequences are unless we do something about it. So yung doing something about it, ito na yung pag-uusapan natin next, and we can amplify this during the discussion later. And I want to start with water because nothing in life happens without water, and certainly nothing in nutrition happens without water. So you have to have a very good source of clean and safe and sufficient water. Now, water is 71% of planet Earth. So you might think, o di hindi naman pala problema kasi ang daming tubig naman sa planet Earth, no? Pero pag tiningnan mo kung anong klaseng tubig ang pinakamadami, makikita ninyo 97.5% is salt water coming from the oceans. So halos lahat niyang 71% na yan ay salt water. You have 2.5%, which is fresh water, and that is what we use for all of human activity, for all of life's activity, except the ones that are in the ocean. No? So lahat ng mga land activities ng natin ay nanggagaling ng or affected by this 2.5%. And this 80%, almost 80% of this fresh water is in glaciers. Now, with climate change, eto na dyan siya pumapasok si climate change. We know that these glaciers have been reduced. We don't know yet by how much, although this was a 2019 report. I didn't see the link that they made to climate change yet, but they might be doing that pretty soon. So there is that opportunity for more groundwater. Now, the melting of the glaciers and the ice caps has other consequences, but in terms of a from the perspective of freshwater supply, this might actually be a little helpful because that increases the proportion that goes into the groundwater, with some caveats that I'll discuss later. So itong groundwater goes into our lakes, it goes into our soil, it goes into our rivers, and that is what we use to live. So yung storya ng tubig ay napakahalaga kasi alam nyo naman to, no? This is our water cycle. I'm just showing this. We took this up in grade school. I'm just showing this to remind you that all, again, like our food system, all of water is interconnected, no? And this is an idealized picture of our water system. Kasi kung titingnan natin yung nangyayari ngayon, because of human activity, a lot of our water has been, let me say, compromised. No? And I'm only talking about fresh water here, has been compromised. And we are either forced to process them more so that they can be safe and useful to us, or we are forced to make do with less and less water. I don't know if you are from the south of Metro Manila like we are, pero kami ho dito sa south, I live in Las Piñas, we have been experiencing a reduction in our water supply for the past 3 months na ngayon. Mula pa noong December, we only have water for a few hours a day. And this is because of siltation and contamination in Laguna Lake, which is where most of our water comes from. So malaking problema po talaga itong tubig, not just because of climate change, but because of the human activities that affect our water supply. So nakikita nyo dito, almost 60% of our water is evapotranspired, o dumadaan yan through our forests and plants para magamit natin as part of the water system. But what is happening to our forests and what is happening to our plants because of climate change, as well as because of our human activities, no? So tingnan natin kung ano yung nangyayari. Okay, before I go into that pala, the other aspect that is very much related to water is land use. So alam naman natin from an economic perspective na maganda talaga na ang land ay gamitin natin in a way that will benefit the most people. But who will decide what is the best use? And this is from if I'm not mistaken, from Zambales, no, from the shoreline of Zambales, and we know that up in those mountains, there's a lot of mining activity that is occurring. Ito pong mga bundok ng Zambales, dati po yan ay puro forest yan. It was all covered by forest, but because of very intensive and extensive mining during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, we lost all those trees. So this is what it looks like now. It's still there, but we are no longer able to use it for the evapor respiration that we need to maintain our water supply, diba? So I told you earlier that I was going to talk a little about our rice terraces. Of course, this is a very romanticized part of our agriculture, but it is also one of the most vulnerable, and it, to me, exemplifies all of the challenges that our food production system is now going through because partly because of human activities exacerbated by climate change. Let me put it that way, no? So ito kasing mga rice terraces, I served as a scientist in Erie for 3 years, and one of the things that we noticed, because we had a project up in the Cordilleras, is that the area for rice production in the Cordilleras has been shrinking dramatically. And most of the time, ang hindi na nila na-farm ay yung dito sa may bandang itaas ng mga bundok, no? Dati daw yan, kikita nyo naman na ito mukhang dinadamo na dito doon sa bandang taas kasi hindi na nila ma-farm, no? The reason being, wala na raw tubig. Wala ng tao, also, konti na yung tao para mag-farm, but even more crucial than mas konti na ang tao ay wala ng tubig doon sa taas. Now, the traditional systems of the Ifugao was to allocate sufficient areas for woodlots, for forests, so that there will be this functioning water system para magkaroon ng mga mountain streams. If you've ever been to the rice terraces, I'm sure you've seen that, na may mga mountain streams which are channeled to the rice paddies and enables our brothers up in the Cordilleras to produce rice despite the very harsh environment of the mountainous terrain. Pero they've managed to produce this, kahit nasabihin natin na hindi 2,000 years ago, for hundreds of years, no? To produce enough rice for them to live on, because of this careful balance between having sufficient trees and woodlots to absorb the water and channel them into mountain streams for the rice paddies. And then they have designated Sweden fields, yung mga ginagamit nila for other agricultural purposes para magkaroon ng sufficient food and water ang mga nakatira doon. So yun yung very well studied na balance between the natural environment and the human environment. But now, because of climate change, what were we observing during our project there? Mas mainit na ngayon. Ewan ko kung napunta kayo ng Baguio recently or during the summer in Baguio, na mainit na. Kahit dyan sa Ifugao, sa mga bundok, malamig pa rin, of course, compared to where we are in Metro Manila, pero mas mainit na siya. So that means that the kinds of trees that can grow and the kinds of plants that can provide this very crucial function of evaporespiration has also changed or are changing. So that means na kahit na walang human confounders dyan, human activity confounding, maaapektuhan talaga ang rice production. Dahil din sa mas mainit, merong mga varieties ng rice, and maybe we can talk about that a little more later, na mas mabilis na siyang mag-mature on planting. And we know from our basic understanding of biology na pag mas mabilis ang isang halaman na tumubo, there is less opportunity for nutrient deposition. Mas konti yung mga nutrients na napupunta dun sa rice grains. Kaya nga sinasabi nila ay mas konti na ang proteins kapag ang rice ay tumutubo sa with the increase in the temperature of our environment. So totoo po yan, pinag-aralan po yan, pero there are ways of dealing with that. We can discuss that later. But this is just to illustrate to you how important water and land use and the balance of these are, and that balance is affected by climate change and very much exacerbated by human actions. Binaliktad ko yata yung sinabi ko kanina. Pero may interaction kasi yung human activity sa kayang climate change. We can discuss that later. Pero ganun nga yun. Ganun ang nangyayari. Kaya naaapektuhan ang ating food production, yung quality ng nutrients sa ating pagkain, at yung nakukuha nating pagkain, resulting pagkain from that kind of environment. Now, I feel very strongly about this forest kasi alam nyo ba na halos buong Pilipinas, I don't have time to discuss what it used to be like mga in the 50s, no? Na halos buong Pilipinas ay covered by forests. Pero ngayon ay nasa mga 10 or 15% na lang yata, or maybe even less. It keeps decreasing every year. And this is how those forests are distributed. And the most important one, well, they're all important, but for our water supply, it's really the closed forests that are important. And kakaunti na lang yan. Also, the mangroves, very important for our supply from the seas, food supply from the seas. So, ang laki ng nawala sa atin from deforestation of the, as I said, 60s and 70s. But I'd like to end with something hopeful. No? During the previous administration, there was a big effort, tawag nila National Greening Program, to plant trees. And we know because we were part of this, so makikita nyo, ito yung target nila, yung light green, ito yung finally na-achieve nila, yung dark green. And they were improving up to 2015, and then 2016, bumagsak ang ating planting activities ng trees dahil iba na yung ating naging administration. But I take comfort and hope from the fact na pwede natin imagine the increase from 129 to 360 in terms of 1,000 hectares that were planted during that 5-year period lang yun. So I think it can be done. There are so many things that we can do to mitigate and adapt to climate change, but we do need to hurry up. And we do need to address this because we are important compounders to that relationship. So I hope we've given you 1% inspiration. 99% po ay nasa atin na. So thank you, and I hope that gives you food for thought and a lot of food for discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ses. I'm a bit at a loss for words after your presentation because of how much information and knowledge is there, but also it really brings home the point of what critical situation we are right now in relation to climate change and food security. But thank you so much for trying to pack that all in such a in those slides and in the limited time that we have. And I think even if you said that you were going to focus more on the nutrition side, I think this already very readily illustrates how all of these aspects are linked. We can't talk about nutrition, climate change without talking about the water cycle or water systems and land use. And I think that's very important point that you mentioned of what human activity plays in all of this. So you're mentioning, human activity in terms of, say, pollution or, impacting the use of the land. But even climate change itself, in the context that we're talking about it, is a human-induced change. The rate with which the climate is changing now, and the reason it's becoming more and more problematic, is because of human intervention. So all of these issues, I think, at the end of the day, is because of human-induced activities and how we are affecting natural systems in a way that is detrimental to the environment and to us as people alive at this day and age. Um, Before we move on to the moderated discussion, I see that there are some questions that have come in the Q&A box, and thank you to Dr. Ortiz for answering some of them. If we can't answer them in the box, we'll try to answer them later in the Q&A. But please keep them coming either in the Q&A box. You can mention if it's directed to a specific panelist or just a general question. And I did also see some raised hands. Unfortunately, we cannot really take raised hands through the discussion because we are trying to efficiently use our time, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. So I see some raised hands, but we cannot take, because there are so many participants and still a lot to get through, we won't be able to take live questions, but the Q&A box is there, and our open forum will be there later, but we will be moderating the questions that we will be taking. Okay, so now to move to our even further into our discussions, because we have already started with the presentation from Dr. Seth. So the first question, actually, a lot of this has already been answered in the presentation, but maybe I will now turn over to Dr. Halos and Dr. Ortiz to sort of maybe add to what has already been said, and other aspects that have not yet been touched on. So our first question for our panelists is quite general. We're backtracking a little bit. Is how is climate change affecting the production and availability of food in the Philippines? The Doc Sass has touched on this a little bit, but I think there are some aspects that have not yet been covered. So our first question is on production and availability of food, and maybe our speakers can touch on some projections. If we can talk a little bit about numbers and statistics regarding agriculture and food production, and how that is correlated with the increasing rise in global temperatures. Maybe Dr. Halos, if you'd like to go first.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, let me just talk about the impact of extreme events in agriculture and in food supply. We have studied the statistics from, we gather actual data on losses, production losses in crops and in livestock and fisheries in the Department of Agriculture. And in the last 10 years, what we have seen is that on the average, we lost about 29 billion worth of production losses. More than 95% would be on crops, and the rest would be 3%, I think, on fisheries, 1% on livestock, and then or 2% on livestock. It's really mostly on crops, okay, and that the losses on infrastructure and other government provided services is actually very small. So most of the losses are borne by our small farmers and fisher folks. And that is one of the big programs that the department is focusing on to help our farmers and fisher folk become resilient to climate change, and especially on these extreme weather events. The major cause of production loss are typhoons, which is about 88%. And second to that, very, very far second would be drought. Okay. Now for typhoons, typhoons would come. There's no way we can prevent the typhoons, but we can prepare for them. And one one fact that also stood out from the data is that, let me see, about 40% of the losses is on rice. And that and this is due to the harvest time. Most of the harvest time happened during the event of destructive typhoons. Okay, so when do the destructive typhoons occur? Most of them would occur in the fourth quarter. You will be surprised because when I was young, there were no typhoons during the fourth quarter, Christmas time, but no longer. Most of the typhoons occur during the fourth quarter, a few during the third quarter, not in the first and second quarter. So one of the measures that the department is promoting is to change our planting schedule for rice and other crops that are affected, most of our annual crops, we should say, because that's the one that you can change the planting schedule, right? The perennial crops, they're there, all the time. So we have to, and also, because most of our losses are on perennial crops anyway, so we focus on that. And the measure that we are promoting is to change the planting schedule. Now, for rice, for example, most of the planting is done during June, July, August, and our harvest time would be September to November. And those are the season for these super typhoons. That is also one of the observations that we made, that we are having super typhoons, they're very often already. So, and they occur mostly in the fourth quarter. So that's one of the measures that the department is promoting, change the planting schedule for rice. So that would hopefully will reduce our production losses. We even look at how much production loss vis-a-vis our imports, and we find that significant amount of that production loss could cover our imports for rice. So, dyan na muna ako.
Thank you, Doc Tina. Ako po, that's also quite surprising to me that the majority of typhoons now happens in the latter part of the year, because
from being typhoons, super typhoons.
The super typhoons. Yeah. Because from when I was a child also, parang tag-ulan is, July, August. But now, even if, it's out of season, the strongest ones are happening as you explained. Thank you po. Doc Monica, would you like to add to that or explain some other
Sige,
information?
I'll add to that because I think Dr. Halos explained yung sa extremes. Siguro I'll do some explanation on the more, sabihin natin, slow onset impacts of climate change on agriculture. So, because of climate change, temperatures are increasing. Ibig sabihin, umiinit, not just in the daytime, also in the nighttime. And this can have a lot of impacts on crop production. Dahil kapag mainit, when it's hot, there's a lot of heat stress on crops. And when crops are under heat stress, siguro maraming sa atin naging mga plantita or plantito over the pandemic. Alam natin kapag nasistress ang mga halaman when they don't have enough water, when it's too hot, they don't grow very well. So because of this, yield or yung ani, yung harvest is usually lower. This is the projection for climate change due to the increase in temperatures. In fact, some of the, hindi siya a rough estimate of how rice production, dahil rice ang top crop natin, is that for every degree Celsius increase, roughly between 8 to 10% ang losses in yield for rice production. And this is because when it's hot, it really affects the flowering part, yung stage ng flowering ng bigas, ng coconut, ng banana, lahat ng crops natin. It has the potential to reduce flowers and to make them sterile. So kapag walang flowers, bumababa po yung ani. We don't have enough yield because of high temperatures. So that's one, yung temperatures. And not just for crops, higher temperatures means that it's also creates poorer living conditions for livestock. Yung mga animals, cows, chickens, pigs na that are grown for meat, for example. And then also for aquaculture, ay nako, ang daming impacts ng climate change. Just thinking about temperature on aquaculture and fisheries. Because as sea surface temperatures rise or sea temperatures rise, we have, nabanggit na nga po ni Dr. Says, we have harmful algal blooms tulad po ng red tide. And the ocean is also becoming more acidic dahil po sa carbon dioxide. When there's more carbon dioxide, it dissolves into the ocean. And when the ocean is more acidic, it's not a very nice place to live for marine organisms. And for shellfish and mollusks, the acidic environment means that humihina po yung shells nila kasi hindi na po nagiging available yung calcium, yung carbonate sa tubig. So that's some of the impacts on crops, on animals, and on aquaculture and fisheries. And that's just temperature. When we think about rainfall, we know that drought is very damaging to crops when there's not enough water, there's not enough moisture. On the opposite end, kapag binabaha tayo, when there are a lot of floods, we lose all the crops. We don't get to save anything. Kapag may bagyo, the winds blow down most crops, for example. And another factor that comes into play is when you have high temperatures, high humidity, changing rainfall, pests and diseases can also become more prevalent. They can become more, the conditions become more favorable. Isipin nyo, mga fungi, they like it when it's moist, they like it when it's damp. And when there's a lot of changes in precipitation, they can affect crops, they can cause diseases. And this puts pressure on farmers because now they have to spend more money on pesticides, on chemical inputs, and so on and so forth. So hindi lang siya food security in the sense of availability of food, but it's also food prices, prices ng inputs, and this is a whole system, as you said, Attorney Aya, for thinking about food and agriculture and the communities that depend on them. So marami pong impacts on climate change to production, to nutrition, as Dr. Seth said, and especially, we feel that especially when we have extremes like typhoons or yung El Nino. Naalala ko pa yung 1998 El Nino, there was a big camping Tabang Mindanao because El Nino struck hard that year in Mindanao. And that's not climate change, that's just climate variability. So climate change might even enhance existing risks, existing El Nino. Mas lalo siyang ma-aggravate due to those things. So yun yung more slow onset temperature and precipitation impacts of climate change on food security.
Thank you,
Aya?
Doc Monica. Yes, Doc Marilyn, go ahead.
May I just jump in? Was this one? I would just like to ask Dr. Halos and Dr. Ortiz, since they both mentioned agricultural practices and the waters, the oceans. I noticed that even in the global climate environment, the global climate conversations, while carbon dioxide is a significant contributor of greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide is not really being talked about, and so is methane. I think when we talk about carbon dioxide, we should also talk about nitrous oxide because, as Dr. Ortiz said, the dead zones in the oceans, are a significant source of nitrous oxide. And modern agricultural practices, the tilling and soil cultivation, livestock waste management, fertilizers, nitrogen-rich fertilizers, significantly contribute to nitrous oxide emissions. And I learned before in my classes, I don't know if this is true, but my teacher told me that a single nitrous oxide molecule has about 300 times the global warming potential of a single carbon dioxide molecule. And yet, little global action and little national action, or we don't even talk about nitrous oxide. Why is that? And how can we reconcile this? Our agricultural practices, the marine biodiversity in the oceans, how can we save all of these things, do these things without emitting much nitrous oxide emission? Nitrous oxide gases.
Yes, okay. The major contributor of nitrous oxide emission actually is agriculture. Okay. But that is because we cultivate the soil. Once you cultivate the soil, you release this, you make the bacteria active in there, and then they release the nitrous oxide. And also, well, in the Philippines, we don't use much fertilizer. We don't use the same amount of fertilizer as other countries, you know. So you cannot say it's really the fertilization. It's mostly cultivation that is
Cultivation. Okay.
that is the source of the nitrous oxide. As far as methane is concerned, our number one emitter of methane is actually again paddy rice,
Oh,
because what's this? Because of the anaerobic cultivation of the rice, and that's why we in the department we are promoting what we refer to as alternate wet and dry, wherein the rice is not continuously cultivated under water. It's every 14 days you have to remove the water, something like that. So that's one of the ways that we are trying to reduce methane emission. Also, the other major source of methane emission is manure management and what's this? This metabolism of uh, the cattle and carabao and all those ruminants. So those are the sources. See, so it's quite difficult in agriculture because these are all, these are traditional practices in agriculture.
yeah.
Yeah, so we have to come up with new ways actually so we can produce food without producing without emitting that much carbon. But in the Department of Agriculture, we also have a very large carbon sink, which is our coconut plantations. See, because another way to reduce, of course, to manage the carbon emission would be to come up with carbon sinks. We have 3.6 million hectares of coconut, and that can absorb twice the amount of carbon emission from our actual agricultural practices today.
Oh, okay.
Nevertheless, we joined the call for the reduction. The Department of Agriculture is promoting practices that will further reduce the carbon emission from agriculture. Okay, so we promote AWD, for example, in rice cultivation. We are coming up with a better program on manure management, and also we hope to start an experiment wherein we can reduce the emission. How would you call that again? The emission from the ruminants, there's
Enteric
a new
fermentation.
study. There's a new study in enteric fermentation. They refer to it as enteric fermentation. And there's a new study of using seaweeds. This particular seaweed is found in the Philippines also. So that's one of the studies that I'd like to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Halos. Yes. Dr. Ortiz?
Sige po, I'll add also, pero very comprehensive po ang sagot ni Dr. Halos. But it's true, when it comes to agriculture, we often, as he said, we often talk about carbon dioxide because it's the fossil fuel product, di ba?
Yeah.
But when we think about agriculture, it's the main contributor of methane. As Dr. Halos mentioned, hindi naman po tayong masyadong mabigat on beef and cattle production. Our methane is more from paddy rice. But when we look at the global picture, producing beef really produces a lot of methane. Kaya nga po, in part of calling for climate action, globally, there's a lot of discussion on shifting diets in order to reduce this methane production from eating so much dairy, eating so much beef, and turning instead to healthier, more plant-based diets. We can also address methane emissions. And in so doing, we also reduce nitrous oxide because we have less crops to cultivate, we have less soya to grow for the livestock that we're growing. So it's a very different picture when you think about developed and developing countries where the priorities are. But it's true that agriculture is not just a victim of climate change.
Yeah.
It also contributes to
Right, right.
greenhouse gas emissions. Tama po yun.
Right. Thanks a lot. We fart, but we fart, no? We fart methane.
Yung
We do-
mabaho po nating methane po
We
yun.
fart methane, right?
Opo,
So humans fart,
yun po
but
yun.
it's just it's small. I don't know how big it is, but we all fart
I
methane.
don't know how big a fart is. Pero dahil po yung cattle production, especially in developed countries, is very, very intensive po.
Yeah,
Eh, and
Yeah.
as Dr. Halos mentioned nga po, it's also manure management. And
Yeah,
a lot of the reduction on farm can be done by measures such as improving efficiency on farm, how manure is managed, how
right.
the quality of life of livestock then can also improve reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Because I can't imagine people turning vegans, or vegetarians.
And
Yeah.
mahirap po to think about the whole world, but that's something that is part of the solution. It's
Even
part
here
of
in
the array of solutions
Yeah.
of
The
addressing.
UN incidentally has declared 2021 as the start of a decade of ocean science for sustainable development, because they really are concerned about the dead zones, the one that you mentioned, Dr. Ortiz. So just to let us know.
I think so. I think very much so, because apart from agriculture impacts, aquaculture, fisheries,
Yes.
rising sea surface temperatures, ocean acidification, these affect biodiversity.
Right.
Coral reefs. For example, I think they declared yung Great Barrier Reef sa Australia is pretty much dead na daw po.
Yeah.
Biologically, it's in a very, very poor state, kung hindi pa dead, very point of crisis. And the Philippines, as the part of the Coral Triangle, is very much suffering these impacts also. And when biodiversity isn't healthy, agriculture isn't healthy also, because agriculture depends on biodiversity. We depend on bees, we depend on pollinators, we depend on natural predators for agriculture, for aquaculture, all this a food chain. Even if we lose something that we don't eat, this something that we don't eat is eaten by something that we do eat. So again, it's all connected in terms of impacts.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. Thank you, Aya.
Thank you, everyone. Doc Seth, did you want to add something po?
Yes, Alaya, I'd like to join the discussion and
Please,
bring in
yes,
some
Doc.
of the nutrition perspectives to some of the factors that Dr. Halos and Dr. Ortiz have mentioned. No, but first, so in terms of this the anaerobic practices for rice, no, kasi alam naman natin kaya naman fina-flood ng ating mga farmers ang rice fields is to help manage the pests. Yun yung primary reason. It's not because the rice needs so much water, because it doesn't. We can actually use drip irrigation. So that is something that has been experimented on and has been found to be very helpful. Para targeted lang yung parang yung ginagamit sa Israel, di ba? Ganon din ang ginagamit nila for many of their agricultural production. Pwede mo rin gawin sa rice yun, and the yield doesn't suffer. In fact, for some varieties, it actually increases. So pwede talaga yun. And then yung sinasabi ni Dr. Halos na anaerobic, yung alternate wet and dry, sinasabi niyang AWD, maganda rin yun kasi it also helps to manage the heavy metal uptake of rice plants, no? Kasi pagka nada-dry out, nag-change yung soil environment, so nagiging less possible na matitake up ng rice plant yung heavy metals, and so if you time it right, then you can actually reduce also the uptake of these harmful metals. Ngayon, yung shifting diets, I think this is something I should probably tackle, no? Let me start out by saying na actually sa Pilipinas, hindi ganon kalaki ang ating beef production, not beef consumption. Of course, the production is also low. Most of our beef that we consume is a lot of it is actually imported, no? Ang main land animal nating na kinakain ay pork and chicken, which are far less contributing to greenhouse gas emissions than beef. Although meron din. Pero mas konti talaga. But even then, actually, if you look at the National Nutrition Surveys, ang talagang natin, usual combo ay rice and fish. Rice and fish talaga tayo. Kaya napakalaking hindi na to climate change, pero napakalaking factor talaga yung the fact that our fishing grounds have been severely restricted by political reasons, and that we are in fact now importing frozen fish. Kasi rice and fish talaga yung ating traditional diet, no? So from a climate change perspective, our diet is not bad. And the rice and fish is usually supplemented by vegetables also that we grow around our households. And this is talking of the usual rural scenario, but now increasingly because of the pandemic, people are also in the urban areas are also planting their own vegetables, and that's how they supplement their diet. So to increase the diet diversity. And this is all good from a climate change perspective because the nutrients don't have to travel. Kasi every time na sasakay ang pagkain sa kahit anong sasakyan yan na demotor, de syempre nakaka-affect yan sa ating climate. So yung ating practices ay I think not that bad. Of course, there are portions or some segments of our population who could be improving their animal consumption by reducing it, also by reducing their consumption of imported foods, because that all contributes to climate change. No? So I think it's not, the message should not purely be shift to a plant-based diet, but also shift to a locally sourced diet. I think dapat magkasama yon, no? Na increase your plant food intake, yes, as well as source your food closer to home. And even for disaster management, and this is something that we have been, when I was still with government, I used to work for the Food and Nutrition Research Institute, and we were working with the SWD on yung mga emergency packs nila, no, kung saan manggagaling, ganyan. We were actually pushing for locally sourced foods kung pwede. Kaya yung mga LGU na may capacity na bumili from their own farmers, at yun ang gamitin nila para sa kanilang mga emergency food packs, that would be great. So kung napansin niyo during the pandemic, yung ating mga emergency food packs, of course, marami pa ring delata. Pero meron namang mga LGUs na increasingly, nagbibigay ng kalabasa, nagbibigay ng, in fact, may nakita ako na nagbibigay sila ng fresh fish. Kami dito, nakatanggap kami ng chicken once. At least nakatanggap pa. So I think that mindset also of going beyond, that was the third thing pala, reduce also processed foods, kasi the processing adds to of course the harm to the environment, no? So yung tatlong yon, I think napakahalagang approaches to changing the diet and individual behaviors ng mga tao. Then if I may, Alaya, kasi may mga questions dun sa Q&A na naka-address sa akin, pwede ko na bang i-tackle, or would you like to tackle something else first?
I think pwede po towards the end, Doc, kasi they're quite specific. So we'll keep the discussion going, and then we'll come back to them. But if you, in the meantime, if you want to address some of them in the box, you can also do that po, and then the others we can address later. Thank you po. Okay, so before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to maybe do not really a synthesis, but kind of go back to a few of the points that really struck me. Of course, it's such an interesting discussion, and we can see in the chat box how people are really engaged and actually very expressing their gratitude that they are able to hear this from our speakers, and I feel exactly the same way. Even if I work in this area, broadly speaking, and have heard many of these points before, it's such an enriching discussion, and we still have quite some time to go. And I also wanted just to appreciate that our speakers are really explaining things very well, considering that they're quite technical. We're talking about science, data, statistics, things that we can't see. But I think everyone will agree that it's been very, very enlightening just to hear these details. And just a couple of points that I wanted to touch back on. I really liked how to respond to the first question, see, Doc Nina talked about extreme weather events that are climate impacts, and how those affect our food security or agriculture. And then Doc Monica talked about the slow onset impact. And I think maybe to some of us who are not, familiar with these distinctions when we talk about climate impacts, I think that's a very good point to be made, that maybe some of us think of, climate change extreme, it's always going to be very visible, like Typhoon Odette that caused billions of damage to our agricultural crops and loss of livelihoods that we can quantify. And we think like, oh, climate change, it's, really big monumental events. Yes, those are very visible, very emergency type climate impacts. But there are also this other set of other impacts that are slow onset. We cannot observe them immediately or in the short term, but they are definitely impacting our food systems, our biodiversity, our ecosystems over the long term. And maybe those are the ones that are harder to catch or harder to communicate or to explain, because unless you're studying it closely, you won't necessarily see those impacts in our day-to-day lives. But as Doc Monica explained, it has an impact on, when crops will bear fruit, whether our fish are surviving in an acidic ocean, and so on and so forth. So we can really see the kind of the spectrum of the types of climate impacts that are existing in our, in society today. Um, and just to the sort of latter part of that discussion on not that we are now moving to, I think, sort of like solutions, or like what can we do. I like this discussion about, diets and how we can change our behaviors, because I think ultimately that's what we, as people, not all of us are working in this field, but we want to know, how do we react now, what can we change as individuals, as communities, um, in terms of our behavior, in terms of our contributions, to help in this situation, and also to protect ourselves, because this is also talking about our food security, our health, and the health of our families. Um, so I think this discussion on, shifting diets, it doesn't necessarily have to be drastic, but small changes that we can make in terms of our choices. It's all about choices, I think, when it comes to food, sourcing more locally, and I think just knowing where our food is coming from. That's, I think, the basic. Even if we're not concerned about these giant conversations around, where is the methane or nitrous oxide, or soil health and things like this. Knowing where our food is coming from, having some control in that, because those also have impacts on our health and well-being, um, aside from having those environmental impacts. So I just wanted to touch on those few points, aside from the things we're seeing in the question and answer, before we move to the next question, which is actually quite related to this question now um, of specific impacts. I think Doc Nina and Doc has already touched on this, but just turning our attention a little bit more to the impacts on smallholder farmers, fishermen, and rural communities, because we've been talking in quite broad strokes. But could we ask our speakers to speak a little bit more about the impact on our, our fishermen, fisher folk, our farmers who are really subsisting in farming for subsistence, and how these impacts are really affecting their practices and their livelihoods. Doc Halos, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, our small farmers and fisher folks are highly vulnerable to climate change. You know, like, well, I keep on talking extreme events because this is something that you can easily see. For example, if there's a typhoon, our fisher folks cannot go out and fish, and it also the crops could be destroyed. So what we are doing, again, let me talk about the solutions because we have analyzed all of this already. And one of our solutions actually for our farmers and fisher folks is for them to grow more a diverse set of crops, you know, a mixture of crops, so that if one is lost in one of the extreme events, they would still have other sources of income and other sources of food. So farm diversification is one of the solutions that we are promoting at the department. And we provide them, of course, also with the necessary skills. They're trained, and also some of the tools that are needed. We provide them with credit. Okay, that's one. The other, of course, is for our farmers and fisher folks to be aware of the climate, the weather. Okay, so we have instituted in the department a climate information service wherein you have a 10-day forecast, you have a seasonal forecast, and a spatial forecast. The 10-day forecast would provide farmers information on what the weather is going to be in the next 10 days so that they may not waste fertilizer, for example, because if you fertilize before a rain, nothing comes out of it, or even if you spray your pesticide before a rain, you know, things like that. And seasonal is, you know, there are the Pag-asa would be able to provide you a forecast on whether how many typhoons are expected, and if there's going to be a drought. So again, these are information that our farmers need so that they can make preparations. You see, before we are doing this, we had a study undertaken by our UP Diliman team, you know, social scientist team, who found out that all of this information from Pag-asa are simply what's this? They're not taken into consideration at all by our farmers. Okay, so what we did at the department is to get this information from Pag-asa and then added the important aspects in agriculture. For example, like I said, you know, there's a 10-day forecast, so we teach our farmers that this is how you're going to use information. So that's how we're doing it at the Department of Agriculture. Thank you.
Thanks, Doc Nina. And I really appreciate that you like to focus on the solutions, because at the end of the day, we can keep talking about the problems, but we want to know what is being done, what can be done, what is being improved. So thank you so much. Doc Ortiz, would you like to add to that?
Sure, I can add a little bit because your question was also about smallholder farmers. What are the impacts on them? Also talking about climate extremes. I was part of the team that wrote yung parang record of tropical cyclones in the Philippines, yung typhoons, kung gaano sila kadalas, what months nga sila pumapalo sa Pilipinas. And what we found was that so far, which is very interesting, they are not yet increasing in frequency nor intensity. We are observing them recently. Sabi nga po natin, in the last quarter of the year, they're becoming super typhoons. But when we looked at the very long record, they weren't increasing yet. But what was really increasing was the losses and damages from typhoons. So anong ibig sabihin nun? Bakit hindi naman dumadami yung bagyo, pero tumataas yung losses and damages? And this is because the communities are becoming more exposed and more vulnerable to climate change and other hazards. So in terms of the vulnerability of smallholder farmers, we know that fisher folk and subsistence farmers are truly are some of the most poor communities in the Philippines. and also the very vulnerable to climate change impacts, and also have the least adaptive capacity to deal with changes, to deal with typhoons, and to deal with droughts. So as I'll just point out a couple of resources. Nabanggit nga po ni Dr. Halos yung 10-day forecast. I think a lot of NGOs, naisip ko po is yung Climate Resiliency Field School, is they also educate people how to understand these weather reports. And there's a initiative yung AMIA, ng Department of Agriculture, headed by si Director Alicia Ilaga, where they have vulnerability maps of where Philippine agriculture is truly at the most vulnerable. And I like that thrust sa program po na yun is they hope to disseminate this information through agricultural extension services, through state universities, through NGOs that work with these communities directly. So farmers and agriculture have a lot to do for adaptation, but they're also the most vulnerable. So we have to help, we have to support them. Let's not shift the burden and say, uy, kailangan nyo mag-adapt. We have to share that burden. We have to share that challenge and say, uy, dito tayo makakakuha ng resources. This is how we understand weather reports. This is what crop insurance is, for example. This is alternate wetting and drying. So there needs to be a sharing of this challenge because all of us every day need food, need agriculture. So when our most vulnerable are not being supported, the rest of the Philippines will also be suffering from the impacts of climate change on agriculture. So yun lang idadagdag ko. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. And I think Doc Ses will have something to add, but I just also wanted to make the observation that because when we hear of, sources of climate change, where the most emissions coming from agriculture is often one of the biggest contributors. And I think if we don't nuance that, or if we are not able to break that information down, we just think of agriculture as this one sector where, as you said, Doc Monica, the burden is like, so, mitigate, you have to change your practices, you have to adapt new technologies, etc. But I think that sometimes we sometimes forget that many of our farmers and fisher folk in the Philippines are not they're not actually emitting at that level, and like you said, they actually need more support rather than kind of this wholesale blame game of saying that you have to change
Net
the sector.
zero, ganyan. Yeah, we have to
Exactly.
realize what our vulnerabilities are as a country. And,
Mhm.
and this is yung idea of think global, act local. We have to do both at the same time, not just think global, we also have to act global. But we really have to look at ourselves and say, where are we vulnerable and how can we support that, support agriculture?
Thank you. And Doc Ses?
Yes, so following from that last statement of Monica, that where are we most vulnerable and how do we help the smallholders who are in that situation? And this is really something that brings to mind the importance of choosing the right leaders for our country, because the policies, yung mga binanggit ko kanina na water use at land use, yan ay mga epekto ng mga desisyon na ginawa ng ating mga political leaders na ang tinitingnan lang. So halimbawa, yun nga, ang paggamit ng lupa, somebody made the decision, kailangan ibenta yung ating mga puno kasi malaking income yan. Saan napunta yung income? And then anong nangyari sa lupa? And so, yung sinasabi ko kaninang asset depletion na nawalan ng value or nabawasan ng value ang mga lupa, mahirap ng tamnan. Minsan wala ka na talagang gaanong matatanim sa mga ganong mga klaseng lupa. Yan ay mga consequences na that our smallholders have to deal with. and then we just, put in band-aid solutions. Okay, tingnan mo yung weather forecast. Okay, bigyan ka namin ng ganitong klaseng machinery para mas maayos yung iyong pagtatanim. Pero yung lupa mo to begin with ay may problema. Or yung irrigation systems natin, again, we have spent billions and billions of pesos and taken out huge loans for irrigation systems. But I don't know to what extent they are actually being helpful, because when we go out into the rural countryside, less than half of our farmers actually benefit from irrigation. So anong nangyayari diyan? Anong mga desisyon, bakit yung ating mga irrigation ay doon ginawa, doon nilagay, or sino yung pwedeng gumamit at makinabang sa irrigation? If you are from the south, like I am, south of Metro Manila, like I am, and you've seen the incursions of subdivisions in Cavite and in Laguna, and you see all of these abandoned irrigation canals and bridges, and you think about the billions that were spent there, pagkatapos yung pala i-abandon din after less than the years that they were supposed to be serviceable. Those are political decisions. So that's why these coming elections are really very important, because those decisions continue to be made day after day. Now, going back to the issue of smallholders, so ayun nga, ang aking pananaw dyan ay sila ay biktima kasi wala silang masyadong uurungan na. So, ang naalala ko nung nasa nung nasa IRI pa ako, we were in discussions with the Climate Change Commission for ecological mapping of the country, of the Philippines, kasi para malaman natin saan nga ba ang mga lugar na pwede ka pa talagang magtanim ng maayos, at ano ang mga halaman o ano ang mga agricultural produce na pwede mo pang matanim doon or magawa doon sa mga lugar na yon, because not all our land is now suitable for the kinds of agriculture that we have traditionally practiced. So it is important that I don't know where that is now, baka mas alam ni Dr. Halos kung ano nang nangyari dyan sa mapping exercise na yan dapat na natuloy. Kasi for example, alam natin yung eastern seaboard natin, palagi ang dinadalaw ng typhoons. So hindi na siguro tayo dapat magtanim ng coconuts doon na madaling matumba, or hindi tayo dapat magtanim ng for the areas that are almost constantly flooded, na we have to time the agricultural planting during the periods where it will be both safer and more productive for our farmers. So that kind of planning requires a very strong Department of Agriculture, and
Right.
one that actually uses research and science as the basis for their actions. So ayoko na maging masyadong political. But anyway, I will stop there. Yun yung mga kailangan natin.
Political says. Gusto ko maging political. I want to latch on to what you said. We should choose our political leaders. Remember, we are losing 1.3 trillion pesos because the Chinese have destroyed our coral reefs because of their island building and clam poaching activities. Remember, Agham said that these are documented. Hindi to chismis. These are documented cases of Chinese destruction in the West Philippine Sea. So we should really have leaders who will not sell our oceans and our islands, to the Chinese.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's my most political statement I can say now.
thank you, Marilyn. But I was thinking kasi of these smallholders who are driven to mountainsides because wala naman silang sariling lupa, o kung meron man silang sariling lupa ay hindi naman siya maaring tamnan. So pagka ganon, ano pa yung maitatanim nila? Hindi na sila makapagtanim ng rice. Pwede pa siguro mga root crops. But yung ganong klaseng consequences on the smallholders are, as we've been harping on, higher level decisions that had these kinds of consequences. So yes, we can help the smallholders with these technologies, but I think at the higher level, we need an ecological map. We need a better understanding of where it might be still profitable or useful to plant, what to plant in those areas. One of the things that we studied was that halos lahat ng ating soils dito sa Pilipinas, this was a mapping that was done by the Bureau of Soils, ay mababa ang zinc levels. So, pag nagtanim ka doon, o di syempre, konti na lang yung zinc na maa-absorb ng halaman para mapunta sa ating pagkain. So yung mga ganong klaseng information na manggagaling sa science, sana ay magamit natin to improve things that we can help the farmers with. So alternate wet and drying is one strategy because zinc is a metal, and we can take advantage of these kinds of soil interactions to facilitate the take-up kahit konti lang siya, or kung gusto nating dagdagan yung zinc sa soil, what are the safe ways of doing that? So I'm not a plant scientist and I'm not a soil scientist. These are things that I learned because I was looking at the relationship from food production to consumption, and I was after improving the nutrient quality of our foods. Sorry, Alaya. Marilyn and I got carried away.
No need to
okay.
apologize, Doc.
Can I,
Doc Nina?
Yes,
po,
thank you very much. I would like to address yung sinabi ni Dr. Ses. Na-mention na kanina ni Dr. Ortiz that the Department of Agriculture has been constructing maps, actually climate risk and vulnerability assessment maps. And this would give you the type of, actually it integrated information from 7 or 8 maps from the different agencies. Wherein, of course, we have the crop stability, we have the geographical, how would you call that? Yung risk ng landslides, halimbawa nandun na, risk ng storm surge nandun na, yung mga ganon. So we have placed them all together in one map, and we have now a policy in the department that we are going to assist all provinces for them to come up with their ano na bang tawag nun? Yung crop ano ba yun? Yung plans nila for agriculture, actually, using this map. So we have finished, there are more than 80 provinces. We have finished more than half, I think about 55 already, and we're continuing with that. So that and then under the World Bank program, we have a World Bank program wherein the LGUs are taught on how to use these maps in planning for the I forgot, it's crop their agricultural plans, actually. So that's, like you said, it's a science-based planning exercise, which we are promoting and which we are training the LGUs to use.
I think baka nawala po si Attorney Alaya. Okay. In the meantime, I tried to answer some of the questions po sa Q&A. You're welcome to put more as we go, para sa akin or kay Dr. Ses or kay Dr. Nina. Ayan na po si Attorney Alaya.
Hello, sorry po, biglang nawala yung internet ko. I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm not sure how much I missed, but actually we were thinking of transitioning na po to our Q&A. I mean, it has been a Q&A all along, but now we will open it up to the questions from our participants. Although, because we've been having a very, very interesting discussion, we are running a little bit behind. but because we want to get through quite a few questions, we might have to extend for about 10 to 15 minutes. Hopefully that's okay for our panelists and also to our participants, also especially those who are hoping to hear a response to their questions. So I will now move to our questions from our panelists, and we've been receiving many, both in the chat box and in the Q&A box. I think we can start first with the questions directed to Dr. Akuin, to Doc Ses, since there are, I think, at least 3 that are specifically directed to you. Would you like me to read them out, ma'am, or would you like to go straight to responding?
Sige, please read them out, Alaya. I want to really share the answers rather than just typing them, because I think many others would be interested in them.
Okay, yes, thank you, ma'am. The first question, if aflatoxin is a real problem, and considering that we are a peanut-eating people, is the government monitoring the quality of peanut butter in the market, especially those that are homemade and offered to the less privileged sector? I'll go through all of the questions, ma'am, because you might want to change the order of answering them. So first is on aflatoxin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, aflatoxin. The second one is to Doc Says also, can you expound more on the data on nutrients, macro and micronutrients, proteins that were affected by high temperature? I think in relation to the increasing global temperature. Are there studies on drought or flooding and what happens at the nutrient level? What are these nutrients, and what nutrients are affected? And if not on rice, what other crops are affected? And the last question is, if food quality is as important as food quantity, why is consumption of less polished rice not encouraged? Why is it not more affordable to many? Those are the 3 questions posed specifically to you, Doc Says.
Thank you, Alaya. Let me start with the last question. Why are we not pushing less polished rice? Actually, DA through PhilRice and the DOST through the Food and Nutrition Research Institute have had so many initiatives to promote brown rice. But I think that there are a number of shall we say, higher level factors affecting the availability and the price of brown rice. One is that, of course, you know that brown rice has more nutrients, and that brown rice also has less processing. Kasi to produce brown rice, you only need 1 pass in a milling machine. No? Kaya nga pag wala kang milling machine at binabayo mo, hand milling ang ginagamit mo, you get brown rice already. No? Pero to get white rice, yung natira na yon from the initial pass in the milling machine, you have to mill it again. So that's already added energy, other electricity in order, or fuel in order to get that second pass. And then you lose more of the nutrients with that second pass through the milling machine. So altogether, talagang brown rice is very, very climate friendly and people friendly, because you will get more nutrients. Now, why aren't we getting why aren't we selling more brown rice or making it more available? When you talk to the millers, ang sabi nila, unang-una na kasi daw, kasi pag isa lang yung milling machine mo at nag-alternate ka ng brown and white sa pagmimill mo, may natitirang residue from the brown rice na pag nag-mill ka ngayon ng white ay mahahalo dun sa white rice. So para sa kanila, kailangan linisin pa raw nila yung buong milling machine at para mag-ano ng white. And the market demand for brown rice is very small. So hindi sulit para sa kanila, sabi nila, na mag-brown rice. Yun yung madalas kong naririnig from the millers. The other is that mas maikli ang shelf life ng brown rice. At totoo naman yan, because you have more oils preserved from the milling, mas madali siyang maging rancid. And then because you have more nutrients, it's more attractive to insects. to pests. So kung kayo ay regular consumer ng brown or other pigmented rices, mapapansin nyo yan na mas mabilis mabukbok ang inyong brown rice compared to your white rice. Kasi matalino yung mga insektong yan. Syempre, pupunta sila kung nasaan yung nutrients. Nasa brown rice yan. Kaya mas gusto nila ng insects din ang brown rice. No? So, but there are now technologies to address those. So if you don't treat or process your brown rice any further, you just have a single pass with your milling and that's it. If you eat it kaagad, like within a week, you're fine. If you go beyond a week, then mag-uumpisa na yan, magkaroon ng mga bukbok and things like that. But there are now technologies that are being promoted by the Department of Science and Technology to prolong the shelf life. And I don't have the time or the expertise to go into those details, but you can actually extend now the shelf life to 6 to 8 or even to 9 months. No? So meron ng ganyan, but it requires some additional capital, of course, to apply some of these processing. It's not a harmful processing, no? But it does require some energy because you need to optimize the heating of the kernel so that you can prevent the degradation. It requires the application of carbon dioxide during the packaging process, and of course it also requires better packaging. So in that sense, I think it comes out about a little more expensive. Kaya mas mahal ng kaunti ang ating brown rice. The other thing is that ang mga millers natin, binibenta nila yung darak. Yung, di ba, pag after the second pass of the milling, then nahihiwalay ngayon yung darak o yung brown, yung bran, yung rice bran from the white rice. Yung white rice papakain nila sa tao, yung bran ipapakain ngayon nila yan sa baboy at saka sa manok at saka sa isda. Kaya tingnan nyo yung mga baboy, ang tataba kasi nasa kanila yung nutrients, wala sa atin. So I think that this is a message that we also need to get across to consumers so that ma-break natin itong vicious cycle na sinasabi kasi mababa yung demand kaya hindi nila pinoprocess as brown rice, and push our millers towards using these other technologies to extend the shelf life so more of us can have brown rice. Now, having said that, I don't know if you've noticed the price of brown rice has been going down. And so if we push the consumption higher, we might actually see the day when this is going to be the same. The other advantage that I see is that with brown rice, you actually preserve, I think, about an additional 10% of the weight of the rice grains. About isang rice grain may dagdag na 10% kasi nare-retain yun. Yun ang mga nutrients, yun andun yung mga fiber. How much of rice are we importing? Now, based on the statistics, mga 10 to 15% of our country consumption based on weight, based on metric tons are imported. So kung lahat tayo kakain ng brown rice, ganun kalaki yung mababawas natin sa ini-import natin. At the other advantage is that because shorter nga ang shelf life ng brown rice, it is more likely that the brown rice is coming from a local source since the storage is shorter, so the risks are lower if you are sourcing the brown rice from a producer who is nearer to you than from a producer who is across the ocean. So I think for all those reasons, we should really be consuming more brown rice. Then the aflatoxin issue, unfortunately, this is an area that has not really been given a lot of attention by both our scientists and our program managers. They seem to think that it is not a big problem, but there is data to support the fact that it is a big problem, especially for corn and for peanuts and other ground nuts. Akala nila pag hinugasan mo na at hindi mo na nakikita yung amag, ay wala na yung mga mycotoxins like aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is an example of a mycotoxin. A mycotoxin comes from fungi, kaya myco. Oo. pinoproduce yan ng mga fungi, and if the fungi stays there long enough, the mycotoxin seeps through, kung rice yan, to the middle part of the rice grain. So kahit na hugasan mo yan at mawala na yung color or mawala na yung odor, so wala nang visible manifestation ng fungus or ng fungi, the toxin is already inside. Same thing for peanuts and same thing for corn. No? Nakapasok na yung toxin na yun. So hindi mo makikita. Ang maaano mo na lang ay pwedeng magtai ka, pwedeng magsuka ka, but the other more insidious consequence is when the mycotoxin builds up in your body because of constant exposure to these kinds of fungal infested food products. You run the risk of getting cancers. So yun yung danger ng aflatoxin. Pero konting-konti talaga yung research na napupunta dyan. Alam ko DA has been struggling to get more research done, especially for corn and for peanuts. But my interest, of course, is in rice because so many more people eat rice compared to corn or peanuts. But any research, I think, can be helpful over the long term. So yes, please help us by advocating for more research to go into our food safety as a whole and for mycotoxins and aflatoxin research in particular. Now, the high temperature effect on nutrients, naku, baka mas alam to ni Dr. Nina, no? Kasi what I know is from basic biology and from some studies that we have done on rice. Ang alam ko kasing ginawa namin, so yung research namin sa Cordilleras, yung mga rice varieties na tumutubo doon ay sinubukan din naming patubuin sa lowland, sa Los Baños, at saka I think sa field rice sa Nueva Ecija, they also planted it there. And one of the things we observed was that kung sa Cordilleras ay inaabot ng mga 6 to 9 months yung bago mag-mature yung rice plant para maka-harvest. Pag sa lowland mo tinanim, minsan 4 to 5 months lang pwede mo nang i-harvest, no? Kasi mas mainit. So isa yan sa mga effects ng not so much ng climate change, it was just a change in the environment, but if you can imagine this more pervasive effect of climate change over the whole of our ecosystems, then that could be made into a general statement, no, na habang umiinit, bumibilis ang pag-mature ng mga halaman. Ngayon, these lowland raised rice grains we observed had lower protein compared to the highland planted the same variety, the same kind of plant, same seed source, and then I think some of the metals also like iron, zinc were also different from the, hindi ko na maalala kung mas mataas o mas mababa. Ang naalala ko lang yung protein talaga kasi that was an important consideration for me because rice is a major protein source for us as a country, no? So yun yung mga alam kong consequences. Maybe Dr. Nina can add to that. Thank you.
Thank you po, Doc Ces. That was a lot of very meaty questions with very detailed responses. So thank you. I think we can move on to some of the other questions because we are getting towards the end of the program, but thank you so much, Doctor. To those who haven't been monitoring the Q&A box, there are also some that have been posed and answered. So if questions, as we go, answers are there of Dr. Monica and some will respond. Put them there, so please look at them so that you can also look at those responses, even if you don't tackle them live. Some
Hello po. I think Attorney Aya is a little choppy. Um, so I think Attorney Aya po is choppy. So I'm Nicole. I'm helping her po on the
Yes
para
po,
bukas
please.
end. But I think I can ask for the next question already. I think this was a question po
Thank
that
you, Nicole.
was, I think, po would be very good for Dr. Halos to answer, especially. And it concerns po the use of genetically modified technologies because it's come up po several times in the chat box. So there have been questions po about how we reconcile the push for genetically modified technologies with the promotion of organic agriculture, and what the government's framework or policy is on these two aspects. So, Doc Nina, do you want
Okay,
to
thank you
start
very
off with
much.
that?
Yes. As far as genetically modified organisms are concerned, these are highly regulated, okay? So that concerns about safety are being addressed before they are commercialized. Now, in terms of also on our push on organic agriculture, see the department is, what's this, would leave the decision to our farmers actually, okay? Because there are advantages of using genetically modified crops, as well as there are also advantages of growing organic products, except that you have to remember that most of our farmers do not want organic agriculture, okay? We have been pushing it. How much have we spent? Okay, starting in 2011, we have been spending 900 million to push for organic agriculture every year until I think that took about 5 years. And then from there we have reduced because the uptake for organic agriculture is very, very small. Within that period of time, according to law, the organic organic agriculture farms should have been, for them to be recognized as organic, they have to be certified. Now, within that period of more than 3 billion pesos that DA spent to promote organic agriculture, we only had more than, not even 2,000 hectares were certified, okay? So that's the uptake for organic agriculture is very, very low. Whatever we have done everything, I think. We even give free organic fertilizers. We give, it's being pushed by the extension people. It's very, very small. The uptake is very small. Now, in terms of GM corn, for example, GM corn was introduced in 2011. The government did not spend any money to promote it, okay? What we did, the money was spent on regulating GMOs. And we have been spending for 10 years from 2020, yeah, let me see, 2021. Anyway, for 10 years, we spent only $250,000, an average of $250,000 pesos, okay, to regulate, not to promote, but to regulate, so that what is being released should be safe, okay? So that's the experience of the Department of Agriculture. Right now, we maintain the regulatory system so that we're sure that whatever is released over there is safe. That's the Department of Agriculture. But the promotion is done by the private sector. It is promoted among farmers by farmers themselves. So, and they may earn more money. That's the other thing, because the reason that of course our farmers are, you'll be surprised, are businessmen, where they make more money, they'll go into that. They have a sure market. That's why they get into the GM corn, for example. The market is already there. For organic agriculture, it's very difficult to market because it's more expensive. So you have to have special markets for organic agriculture products. So those are the reasons over there. And like we said, we support the decision of our farmers, whether they go organic, whether they go GMOs. All we need is to ensure that the products are safe.
Thank you po. Aya is
Thanks so
back,
much.
so I will
Yeah,
turn
sorry.
over to her again.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. And I apologize to everyone. They are suddenly doing repairs on the internet on our street without warning. So I'm relying on my phone and it's a little bit shaky, but hopefully we can hold on until the end. We just have, I think, a couple more questions to go. And then our synthesis. And I think one of the comments that we got in the chat is about the comprehensive land use plan or policy. And it's not really a question, but I think this is to Dr. Aquin's point on the importance of land to nutrition, and obviously most of our discussions on agriculture related to crops and livestock are very much tied to land. And maybe we can get some of the views from our panelists on the importance or the necessity of comprehensive land use planning to respond to these issues. Dr. Monica, would you like to speak on this point?
Yes, I think so. I think the CLUP is really one of the really very important document, a really important plan for the local level to determine how they respond. It includes everything, how it responds to disasters, what is there, including what land use is taken up and all of this. So definitely it's a toolkit, and I think it has been used by a lot of NGOs also as a means to mainstream climate change adaptation. Through land use planning, we can already adapt some practices that benefit agriculture, that benefit disaster risk reduction, and that benefit climate change adaptation. And this can be through measures such as, discuss na nga po mga biotechnology, what types of land use we're using in the particular locality. So definitely, isa po yan sa, well, that's also another issue, is that we're also demanding a lot from our LGUs. Is that yung nga po sinasabi nila sa Pilipinas, there's no lack of policy or no lack of laws, but the trouble is also with the implementation. So we are demanding a lot from our LGUs, from our communities, to conform to so and so requirements. Minsan po nagkaka-conflict din po sila. So I think having the CLUP that is sound, that is well designed, is one way that LGUs can really be addressing future challenges in a comprehensive way.
Thank you, Doc Ortiz. Anything to add from Doc Nina or Doc Ses?
Yes, Alaya. What I'd like to add is, well, as Monica has pointed out, we have some very sound policies, especially at the national level, where our national agencies have been very well informed by science, by research, kasi malapit sila sa malapit sila sa mga academic centers at sa mga scientists natin. So nakaka-contribute talaga ang ating may mga inputs talaga ang science sa pag-formulate ng national level policies. The problem is the implementation. And the way that LGUs sometimes selectively apply our national policies. And madalas kasi dun sa national policy, naglalagay tayo ng room for flexibility to adapt to local to local contexts, which is appropriate. But unfortunately, there are LGUs who exploit those flexibilities in order to still continue harmful use of the land or harmful use of our waters. So tabi na muna natin yung West Philippine Sea, ha? Pero let's say let's talk local level applications of our policies. So nakikita namin yan. We did a small study to look at the effects of mining on heavy metals in our rice fields, and we know it can happen, that it does happen, that if the mining, it's not so much the location of the mine field as it is the water runoffs that are coming from these mine fields. So pagka yung tubig na, kasi ang processing ng mining, pagka tapos na makuha yung mga yung pag-extract pa lang ng mga usable metals, makes use of water. And then to get rid of the yung tinatawag nilang tailings, 'di ba, yung mga yung mga debris at saka lahat ng mga maruming pinagdaanan ng mga mining processing, tubig din ang kailangan dyan. Ngayon, in fact, ang napansin namin dun sa study na yon, the larger mining companies, because they are heavily restricted and heavily monitored, mas sumusunod pa nga yung mga yon. It is the small scale miners who operate under the radar or who have more connections with local leaders. They are the ones who get away with subverting the precautions that have been placed on the mining industry. And we see the consequences because the water runoffs from their mining processing goes into the water that then goes into the rice fields and that then contaminate. So sorry, ang rice ang example ko kasi yun ang pinanggalingan ko at yun yung research na nagawa namin. Nakita namin yun. So, nasa implementation talaga kasi mayroon tayong mga magandang mga batas na naisagawa na. Maganda rin yung panukala dyan sa comprehensive land use that you can only have mining in certain areas and nowhere else. And preferably in the areas na walang nakatirang mga tao kasi para walang consequences sa tao, although syempre may consequences yan sa environment. But also all of the precautions and the safety measures that are important. So I'm not pro mining, but I am pro regulation, and I am for controlling these processes. And it's not just mining; it's all other processing technologies that can bring about harm to our food supply and to our health. So I think yun yung bottom line. We need to strengthen also the implementation of laws at the local level. And that goes back to electing the right kinds of policymakers and decision makers, even at the local level.
Thank you so much, Doc Ses. Doc Nina, some last points on this, and then we can move to our very last question.
Ang ano ko lang ngayon is gawa ng Mandanas ruling, mas malaki ngayon ang resources na available sa local government units. So yun yung ating dapat pagtuunan. Paano ngayon na mapapasunod natin sila? Ito nga, sila ngayon ang mas maraming pera actually. So tama si Ses, kailangan piliin talaga kung sino yung magagaling talaga na leaders natin. Although pagdating sa even among, among or even many Filipinos do not understand the relationship between leadership and the economic condition. Mahirap talaga nilang maintindihan.
Tama, agree po ako dyan, Doc Nina. Sometimes it can be very frustrating, especially since we have all the facts, especially in your fields of science and medicine, seeing in terms of numbers and very specific impacts, and then hindi natin ma-translate to voting power or choosing our leaders. And actually, that's a very, very good segue po to our very last question. But I'll ask everyone to be brief if you can answer in maybe 3 sentences at the most. Our last question is, now that we've covered so many important issues and really illustrated how critical the issue of climate change and agriculture food security are to the Filipino people, how do we now make these issues actually, this is a question from one of our participants, but I'm rephrasing it to make it a bit more general. How can these issues be solved or be made more central to the platforms and the agenda of our either our presidential aspirants or to our candidates, more broadly speaking? How do we push for them to really take these issues seriously as we are about to vote for them in the coming elections? You will start with Doc Ses.
Thanks, Alaya. Siguro 2 words: science communication. We need to improve the way that we communicate the science so that it's not misunderstood, so that it can be seen how it links to very practical things in the lives of people, and that it can be applied also in very pragmatic ways. So the way we communicate this, coming from my perspective as a scientist, that I think that's one of the ways that we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc Ses. Doc Nina?
Ang hirap naman na tanong. Actually, sa akin, no, ang nakikita ko lang kasi nga, karamihan nga ng mga Pilipino talagang hindi nila talaga maintindihan yung relationship nga ng leadership with economic situation and also the future of this country. So, ang ano ko lang is to have communication with our younger generation. Sila dapat ang itatarget natin kasi it's also they also have a very big voting power, no? So, kung magkampanya tayo, ay mas maganda kung yung mga bata kaysa yung mga matatanda. Tigas ng ulo na ng mga matatanda. Basta ganitong yung kapatid ko nga yun BS graduate and everything yun pero ano pa rin, basta ito si gusto ko, tapos na, wala nang usapan, ganon. So, pero mga bata, yun, yung mga apo ko, yun yung aking mga kinakampanya. So yun, we target the youth.
Thank you, Doc Nina. And actually, may isa pong comment dito na related to education, and I think that relates very directly to targeting the youth and educating them and getting them to that place of critical thinking while they're young. And Doc Monica?
Nasabi na po ni Doc Nina yung sagot ko, which is really youth empowerment. Hindi original. But I really agree. And I think what I would add to that is youth empowerment in science. I think that the youth has a very strong voice. We've seen that they are very active on climate justice, climate action. What we also need to do is supplement that with knowledge, and so that they can demand from our leaders, ito na po yung ebidensya, but iba po yung ginagawa natin. And I think apart from pushing it onto our leaders, climate itself will push itself onto our national situation. Every year, 20 typhoons po yan. And I think a candidate that does not address climate change, that does not address natural hazards, is not a very good candidate because it's part of the lived reality. So, kailangan po yan. Knowledge empowered youth.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to tie actually the points from both Doc Ses and Doc Nina. So science communication, youth education, and knowledge empowered youth to package it all very succinctly. And I think if we're talking about science communication, education, I think the 3 of you are very, very good pioneers, I would say, and champions for this, just based on this conversation alone. And I'm sure that you're also doing a lot more in relation to these in your specific fields. We are going to, I'm going to do a very quick synthesis, but Doc Marilyn, did you want to add anything else?
No, nothing else. I just agreed with everything they said, especially on the issue of leadership. And this
Yes.
May 2022, so much is at stake. The life of our planet, our food is at stake. So let's see those people who will not sell the, well, West Philippine Sea to people, other people. Bye. See you.
Yes, agree po ako dyan. Okay, so I will try to go through our synthesis. We covered so many important and interesting points today at both like an information level and also in terms of how these things affect us on a day-to-day basis. And I will try to do it very quickly. So we heard that climate change is a crisis multiplier. It makes existing threats and risks significantly worse. And we see these impacts especially in agriculture and food security. Especially when you look at things as a system, we see how everything is connected and the balance of natural systems have been really impacted by human activity. Climate change affects our food directly, for example, through losses from extreme weather and events, as well as the impacts of slow onset events on productivity, on land and water resources for agricultural ecosystems. And there are also indirect impacts of climate change, such as those on biodiversity related to pollination, crops, and the needs of livestock. So whether climate is impacting agriculture production, distribution, etc. directly or indirectly through other things that in the end also affect our food systems, we can see that climate impacts are wide-ranging when we talk about agriculture and food security globally and in the Philippines. And we heard some of the numbers and the statistics from our speakers on these. Because it is an interconnected system, it is important to look at where we are most vulnerable and support each other in our communities, looking at our specific vulnerabilities as the Philippines, specific vulnerabilities of our smallholders, fisher folk, rural communities, and support them instead of placing the burden on them and saying, agriculture sector, do all your mitigation and adaptation without giving the appropriate support based on data and science, as we have been emphasizing throughout this discussion. And we also heard a lot of the good efforts that the Department of Agriculture are doing to address emissions from the sector, while also supporting our small farmers and fisher folk who are some of the most vulnerable to climate impacts. And we appreciate the effort of Doc Nina to communicate those efforts, the solutions, rather than just focusing on the issues and the problems. And we also heard of a lot of the things that we can do ourselves. Some of these things may sound very far from us. For example, I'm not a farmer. I don't work in the agriculture sector, but all of these things impact us as individuals. So it's also important to know what we can do individually in our community. So for example, shifting to locally sourced food, reducing the intake of processed food. And of course, as we heard, like, I guess we can treat those as final words, closing remarks for our panelists, so to speak, how we as individuals and communities can continue support for science communication, empowering our youth and our stakeholders through activities like this. We, as much as we are informing ourselves and encouraging others to become informed, those are also part of our contribution to understanding these issues and becoming more involved. It's especially as we are making our choices for the upcoming elections, information and knowledge really is power. And we shouldn't be, I always say this because we encounter this issue with data, like the aversion to data or the lack of interest in data. It really shouldn't be something to shy away from, but instead, the less we think we know, that's a good thing, because we know that there's more to learn, rather than thinking na that's too hard for me to understand, or it's the field of some other experts and not myself. But I think loving information as a people is something that we can really improve on and can inform our choices on a day-to-day basis and also for the upcoming elections. So as we go into campaign season. I think we're about to start our formal official campaign season in February. We can do our part in asking our political leaders what is their platform on these issues, or not asking as well as demanding that these should be front and center, because it affects our economy, our livelihoods, the quality of life and well-being of Filipinos, our health. Um, and afterwards, after the elections, to also hold them accountable. So it doesn't end during the elections, but really extends to how much we keep knocking on the doors, and magkalampag tayo ng magkalampag until we feel that these are our leaders are responding sufficiently and effectively to all these problems. And of course, I would like to thank Nicole, my teammate from Para Bukas, who has helped with this synthesis. Always makes my job much easier to have the Para Bukas team also there. And of course, the technical team from PCPD helping with the logistics also. Doc Marilyn, would you like to say any final words?
No, nothing except I really want to thank Dr. Halos, Dr. Ortiz, Dr. Acuin, and of course, Attorney Alayo de Leon for this excellent moderating. And thank you very much for all of your inputs and the practical solutions that we need to do. Now I am more inspired, to talk to the farmers, organize them, at least in my town, to do something about this. There's something we can do. It's not as if it's hopeless. Thank you.
Exactly. And that's I've been hearing this recently, that hope is one of the currency that will never run out. So hopefully we stay hopeful and try to contribute in the many ways we can. Thank you again to our panelists, Dr. Ortiz, Dr. Acuin, and Dr. Halos, for sharing your time and expertise with us. And of course, to our participants, there will be more to come. Please wait for the announcements from PCPD, Para Bukas, and our other partners on the upcoming series. We intend to hold these, I think, once a month, more or less.
Yes.
So the next one is coming up in February.
March.
Tama po. March, sorry. Okay, kasi end of January na pala. So the next one in March, please watch out. I believe that will be on climate change and health. Tama
Health.
po ba, Doc?
Right.
Yes. We'll be zeroing in on health and
And
climate.
then there's one on climate change and gender.
Yes. So we have at least 2 more coming up. So we hope to see you there again. And thank you all for your active participation.
Yes.
Have a good day and have a good week to everyone. Thank you so much.
Salamat.
Thank you.
Initially known as the Population Center Foundation, the Philippine Center for Population and Development was created in 1973 to complement the government's National Population Program. In its first 26 years, PCF implemented projects that delivered information, training, and family planning services. In 1992, the foundation broadened its mandate from population to Population and Development, or PopDev, and it changed its name to the Philippine Center for Population and Development. As a PopDev organization, PCPD implemented projects on community-based health education and services, responsible parenthood, and adolescent development. In 2000, PCPD was reorganized as a grant-giving foundation. It supported the efforts of partners that responded to various concerns, such as housing, waste management, food security, climate change, and reproductive health. In 2020, PCPD decided to shift from giving grants to becoming a social enterprise. It is studying the feasibility of setting up a hospital that would specialize on women's and children's health care, while at the same time provide a broad range of health services to the general public. As it continues to evolve, one thing has remained constant for PCPD. Through its various transformations, PCPD's commitment is to contribute to improve the quality of life of Filipinos.